I was probably still only had Return of the Secaucus 7 come out when Amy and Griffin approached me for, well, we've got this story, this story that Amy had kind of told verbally a bunch of times and told to me. And I said, well, that sounds like a really good movie. And said, well, do you want to try to make this movie together? So we may have already been having meetings about it when I was doing Leanna or in post on Leanna. But, as I always say that, when I made Secaucus 7 and it came out, I was catapulted from absolute obscurity to near obscurity. I think they may have come to a screening of Secaucus 7 that I was talking at, and they introduced themselves. So they got in touch with me. I knew Amy only as an actress who was in Mean Streets, and then Griffin as an actor who I'd seen in a couple things. I didn't know that they had a production company. And about while we were talking with each other was when Head Over Heels, Chilly Scenes of Winter came out. And so I said, oh, well, they've also, actors who've actually made something, which didn't seem that strange to me. So many of the people that I knew started as actors and then ended up producing their own off-Broadway plays, so they had something to be in, and so taking that to the movie world, it just seemed like, well, that's the next step. We started out at one studio. Claire Townsend was kind of an early one of the first women executives at a major studio, and took it a certain length, and then they decided we don't want to make it. And then she very generously started making phone calls for us and said, well, I think they're interested over at Paramount. They may want to pick it up. And they got interested and they said, okay, we're thinking about this. And then they almost greenlit it. They say, okay, we're going to give you the money to do casting and even some screen tests. And for somebody who'd been making, movies in the tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars, the idea of actually spending the money to shoot film, to make a screen test was, hey, I could make a movie for that much, with that much film stock. It was just like, wow, this is the big time. And what I do remember is that when we said, okay, this is the cast we want to go with, Rosanna Arquette and Vincent Spano as the leads, they were, I think they had maybe made Grease or had seen the box office and they had something more glamorous in mind, even though they'd read the script. And then finally, it was pretty much the last minute, they said, okay, you're greenlit. But we're going to make this as a negative pickup, meaning that basically they give a slip of paper to a bank that says, if these people make this movie for this much money, we're going to buy it. And then so you could get the borrowed money from the bank. So it's not an official Paramount movie until you've shot it and you're editing it, and then they kind of buy it from the bank. It was almost a studio movie for me. It was like we had $3 million. This is like I'm making a multi-million-dollar movie. But it was considered, for a studio movie, that was at that time still pretty low. And what it meant is we had a lot of autonomy in who we hired. Once they finally gave us the green light with Vincent and Rosanna in the leads, it was just kind of, okay, well, now we get to make the movie. And then they really didn't reappear until the editing period. She's maybe a year or two older than me. We had kind of similar, working class high school experiences. And so when I heard the story, I said, well, this is great. She was in the girls' locker room while I was in the boys' locker room. This is very familiar to me. I went to a school with in an area with a big Italian American population. It was very mixed school. So we had, Irish kids, Polish kids, a lot of black kids, one Jewish kid. And then she told me the angle where by the time she was going to Trenton High, I think she said that a lot of the Jewish boys were being sent to private schools, but the girls were still going to, public school. And it was was upsetting when they started dating the Italian guys, but when they started dating the black guys, that was it. They weren't going to public school anymore. So the kind of ethnic and racial and class thing was very familiar to me. So when I went on to make it, into a screenplay, it really had the outline of Amy's story that she had told me, which was a lot of personal experience. But then I kind of filled in, other things that I knew about. Amy gave me a really good plot. That high school thing going on to college, which is an unusual thing in kid movies. Usually stay in one or the other. And so I really didn't have to add too much to the plot. But individual scenes and lines, I think I probably did, 2 drafts. I did, my own first draft, and then I looked at it and added a few things for rhythm and just to improve things that I thought could be better. And then I showed it to them. They said, "Oh, this looks good." And they had a few notes, and I think I did them, and then we went out with it. So it was, I write very fast. And so it wasn't a long, long process. And I have to say, there's maybe 2 movies I've ever made where I didn't have to do any research. And this was one of them, because I'd lived enough of the stuff. And, Amy had, filled me on the, the kind of Sarah Lawrence part of it, which I obviously did not go to an all-girls college. And I knew girls who went to Sarah Lawrence and colleges like that, but she'd really, kind of lived that life. She kind of describing the guys. There were guys who were, still wearing like kind of sharp suits and stuff like that, even though you were approaching the hippie, cutoff. He's already kind of, stuck in a culture that is past what he thinks is cool. It's kind of what's exotic and interesting about him for her. I've never met anybody like that. And he's so confident. And that's part of his attractiveness, is his confidence. And everybody else, they may be acting like they've got it together, but they're probably just as nervous about their self-presentation to the world and to their friends or their enemies as I am. And he seems like he's totally cool, in his skin and in his suits. I think it was Bobby Darin who famously, after being this slick guy who, wanted to be the chairman of the board and, was always in really kind of, expensive suits and Frank Sinatra thing going, got religion in the late 60s and appeared in Las Vegas in jeans and, without his toupee on, and just sang some folk songs, and the ownership went crazy on him, and you've embarrassed us and this and that. And he actually had to come and apologize in a later performance. I was really interested in that kind of thing of what happens when your shtick, what you think is cool, is not cool anymore. And Chic runs up against it, is running up against it even in high school. Jill, everything, when you see her acting, in high school, it's all about elocution and, your posture and, those kind of things. And then she gets to Sarah Lawrence and they're crawling on the floor and doing all this kind of Grotowski kind of stuff. And everything she realized that was cool about her in high school is so uncool here. And it was just a couple months transition. And it's like, whoa, what happened? I wanted that jolt. And it was interesting with marijuana. There was a point where there were maybe 3 people in my high school who were smoking marijuana by 1968. And then probably by about 72 or 73, when people's brothers were coming back from Vietnam, and they may have been hardcore country western guys, but they were smoking dope. And their little brothers and sisters are saying, oh, I guess that's a possibility. That was a big cutoff. There were, you could kind of, tell time by, okay, are this kind of people smoking dope yet? And I had to explain to these young actors, okay, this is 1967. You don't know what this is going to do to your mind. It might as well be LSD or some drug you don't even know the name of. You're pioneers here. There may be two of you who've done this before and are cool with it, and the rest of you, you're just trying to pretend like you're cool with it. And so even they were those actors were some were still in their teens because I was really trying to get people who looked the right age, and some were in their early 20s. But by that time, it was like big deal, smoking dope. Bobby Colesbury, who was our associate producer and pretty much the line producer on the movie, he had gone to school near there. I think it's Philadelphia schools. And he said, "Oh, you got to see this movie." And so we showed it for a bunch of the people who worked on the crew. I don't think the actors saw it. And I had seen a bunch of Wiseman's, movies by that point and really liked them. And I still remember that there's a scene where the one kind of hip teacher who's got like beads, on, she's holding up a Simon and Garfunkel album saying, and this is Paul Simon, he's the poet of the group. In my high school, if you listened to Simon and Garfunkel, you were a fucking hippie. As I said, there was like, one or two dope smokers in my high school, and they were just kind of considered hippies, even though they didn't look like hippies. So that was definitely college music, and was one of the reasons it worked so well in those scenes. Some of it was physical and just, he's tall and he moves with a certain amount of confidence. He understood the character right away when he read it. We saw a lot of people for this, and a lot of them were good actors. He was Italian, which was important to me. And, I know that often doesn't happen, but, Sal Mineo and Tony Curtis would play, the same guy in movies, and okay, Sal Mineo can kind of pass as Jewish and Tony Curtis can kind of pass as Italian, but to me, it was like, come on, guys, So, some of it was just my documentary feel that this is really going to work better, with an Italian-American guy. And he did a very good audition. And seemed like, okay, he listens. I had seen him in Over the Edge, and he was very good in that. Kind of a guy who was on the margins, and it's really kind of good movie. I mean, somebody should revive that. And then with Rosanna, she was off working, so I didn't see her right away, but we saw a lot of young women. We came down with like 5 or 6 finalists, and Paramount said, well, put them on film. I said, okay. And I was, I thought, okay, well, I'll look at them in film. I'm going to be making my decision just looking at them and talking with them. But I want to see these people again. And, but it was an opportunity to work with Michael Bauhaus, who was going to be my cinematographer, and for us to get used to each other. And he was having God, I get to do, this is just like Hollywood. I get to do screen tests, And so we actually had a very good time just doing those. It helped that Griffin had worked with Rosanna, because I just realized, there's an emotional part, and she's going to be on screen most of the time. Who's this person? How is she to work with? You can't tell just in an interview, and Griffin having been around her really helped.
You Jewish girls.
About us Jewish girls.
She passed in my experience. She passed for this, which is much more sociological. I was hoping to cast a little bit more by, like, if you were walking down the street, this is what you'd peg this person to have. Also, because they were new actors and not seen a whole lot, I felt like the balance of the film was fine. The audience is going to receive them as the character.
Pleasure to meet you, Joe. They call me the Sheik.
The Sheik?
Yeah.
Not, well, this is who they're playing, and I've seen them in 6 other movies. They don't carry a whole lot of baggage with them. Margie Simpkin did a terrific job. And I remember about the second day of casting, Margie said, so you really do want people who are about the age of the characters? And I said, yeah. I said, well, directors say that, but sometimes they want a safer actor, and they're fine to go with a third, it's kind of like, Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate. I think he was almost 30, or he was 30, and he's playing a guy who just graduated from college, but, the movie worked. partly because we didn't see him hanging around with other college-age kids. I was going to have all these high school scenes. I was going to have high school extras. I was going to have these college scenes. And I really felt like, well, the closer these people are to the age and the experience, the more believable they're going to be, but also the easier for them. They're not going to have to say, well, how would I play like I'm 10 years younger than I am? Which is it's easier to play somebody who's 60 years older than you with some makeup, than play somebody who's just 10 years younger and see what those subtle differences are. I grew up in Schenectady, New York, which was a city not unlike Hoboken or Jersey City, big Italian-American population, very mixed ethnically, kind of working class city. But I had lived in Hoboken for quite a while. By the time I made Baby It's You, I knew it's a mile square city. I knew the city very, very well. So I knew locations when I was writing it. I said, oh, we could shoot this here, we could shoot this here, we could shoot this here. I knew the politics really well, which were very familiar to me. I liked the food. So it just seems like, yeah, we'll just shoot it here. This is close enough to Trenton that we don't have to travel to Trenton. And equipment and crew people are going to be coming over, who live more in the New York side. We shot the high school interiors were up on a hill in New Jersey. There's a nice high school there. They were very cooperative. I do remember for the fight between Sheik and Sam McMurray's character, the vice principal, I wasn't getting the reaction, with the extras who were close around. And I said to, I forget, I think it was the real vice principal. I said, so are like the kids that you put up front the good kids? He said, yeah. I said, well, I'm going to move them to the back. I'm going to move the regular kids here. And so after the rehearsal, when we did the scene, it was exactly, oh shit, there's a fight with a teacher. Kids were standing on the tables and they just got into the scene. We did 2 takes maybe, and they were great. The same thing in the hallways. We shot in Union City, the restaurant where they're in booths and stuff like that. That was in Union City. I think it was an Italian family, not a Cuban family, who owned the restaurant. And we had some women on our crew, and they could not bear to see women handling hammers and, Makita drills and stuff like that. And they kept saying, I'll do that. And I said, no, this is my job. I'm in the union. Michael Ballhaus had shot a bunch of movies for Fassbinder, kind of famously. And he had shot this movie, Dear Mr. Wonderful. And Amy and Griffin showed me that. And I said, well, this guy's really good. There's some really cool shots in this, And I've seen a bunch of these Fassbinder movies, so it would be great if we could get this guy. I hope he speaks some English. Michael was a world-class operator. He had shot a lot of the movies, not just Fassbinder movies, operating. His parents were actors. He really understood drama. He never locked the head down. And his focus puller, Hans Booking, never made any marks on the lens, or almost never on the floor either. He might pace things off. So they're whispering to each other in German. And you'd see Michael during a wide shot, like the scene where they argue in her college room at the end. I just gave him a big cage and I said, just don't leave the room, play it emotionally. And I'm not going to give you marks or anything like that. And I would see Michael kind of whisper something, and it would be, I'm going with the girl, I'm going with the girl. And then this, that, and Hans would be moving the lens. What I discovered is that my low and wide and Michael's low and wide were the same shot somehow. And that, it doesn't mean one's wrong and the other one's right. It's that somehow your idea of the shot and your description of the shot is exactly what the DP is seeing. So when you'd see the dailies, it's like, wow, or you look through the camera, it's like, that's exactly what I asked for, And so that was a nice serendipitous thing with Michael. And he was a fun guy. His 2 sons were working on his crew, so Sebastian and Jan were it was kind of like a U-boat crew. You'd hear a lot of German, but they were very efficient and got the stuff up very quickly. The nice thing about Michael is, having worked with Fassbinder, he could improvise. He told me a couple stories of, sometimes Fassbinder would just not show up for a big shot because he was nervous about it, or he had a new boyfriend and he was off in the hotel next door playing around with him in a bathtub or something, and we'd just shoot, because he told me what he wanted, and then he'd come down and, have we started, So Michael could really handle a lot of things, so I felt very comfortable. If I saw something on the day that I hadn't seen on the scout, just saying to Michael, okay, here's what if we do this? And he said, oh, no problem, no problem. When the first AD would ask him how long it would take, he still pronounced it lightning. He's, for the lightning, hours and hours, and then we'd be ready in 15 minutes. The one curve he threw me is when we went to Trenton, because we have the shot of the sign on the bridge, Trenton makes what the world takes. We left the office in Hoboken very early. We wanted to get, early day, and we had a whole afternoon to shoot in Hoboken. So we were only going to drive to Trenton, do 2 shots, drive back, have lunch, and then shoot the rest of the day. And we get there, and it's about 9 o'clock or something, and I'm tired because I had to get up early and I was working at night. And Michael looks at the sky and he said, this is no good. It's outdoor shot. The light is terrible. I think 1 hour. I think we have 1 hour. I think we wait 1 hour, and then it is beautiful. You go take a nap. So I go and I lie in the back of a car, and then I wake up, and the sky looks exactly the same. He says, no, the ambience is better. We can shoot now. And so we shot, and we did our 2 shots, and we came back. And I don't think he told me we got the rest of the afternoon in Hoboken, and at the end of the day, he said, okay, I confess, we forgot the camera. We left it in the office in Hoboken. And somebody had to drive back to Hoboken, which is not that close to Trenton, and come back and set up. And I swear the sky was exactly the same. I said, okay, Michael, we got the shot. When you're doing driving shots, we had some stunt guys, but mostly Vincent was driving. I don't believe he had a driver's license at the time. I think he'd had a little practice in a parking lot with Harry and Agnes or one of the other stunt guys. So he probably knew how to make a car do a 180 better than he knew how to drive. So, there was a shot where he comes around a corner and during their wild ride together, and Rosanna's really screaming, I think, because he took the curb a little long. And there was a guy who had a period car, poor guy. And we just need it to be parked. It's not going to be in the moving stuff. And I think Vincent, he didn't hit it very hard, but he did rear end this parked car rather than stop short of it. And I was standing next to the guy, and he just you heard this awful groan. We fixed it up for him. I felt like, wow, we have $3 million. We can afford some music. Because before I'd just been, doing our own music with my composer. I can buy some songs, and that was such a part of our lives. Not just that it's the soundtrack of your life, but it was one of the ways that people define themselves. I think still is. There were people who were like just Motown people, and then there were people who were kind of more country western people or Elvis kind of people, or there are people who, even within that, there were people who was like, oh, the Beatles, God, I like the Animals and the Rolling Stones, and vice versa. So I thought that was going to be a really important part of the storytelling. I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go in with 3 choices. I'm going to have a first, second, and third choice. Obviously, there's stuff that we may not get. So Jackie Wilson was in a coma, I think, when we made it. And, he had a couple ex-wives and a girlfriend and maybe a manager, who you had to deal with. And not going to happen with the Jackie Wilson song. So we went to, number 2. Creedence Clearwater were feuding with each other. So one of those was number 1, and we had to go to number 2. We approached Bruce Springsteen. John Landau was his manager at the time, and said, here's the deal. these aren't period, obviously, but they are so much the world that we're talking about that, we're not going to have them coming out of a jukebox, but we want to use them on the soundtrack. Griffin might have known Paul Simon, so we have a couple Paul Simon and Garfunkel songs in the movie version. Paramount did not clear, they told Griffin they were going to clear the rights for the DVD, and they didn't clear them, so I think we lost, though. I think we lost Shout, got very popular after our movie, not because of our movie, but all of a sudden, every time you went to a basketball game at halftime or when there was a lull in the action, they would play "You Make Me Want to Shout," and there was like a commercial that it was used for, and so it got really expensive when we came to the DVD version, and so I think we replaced it with Surfin' Bird, which was cheaper. So I had that shopping list. There wasn't a video for a long time because of that, and about 7 years after it came out, a new guy. There was a new regime at Paramount, and a new guy came and said, "How come this movie isn't out? This is a great movie." And, well, you have to clear music rights. We're going to have to actually spend some money. And he said, "Yeah, well, let's do it." So finally they cleared it. I'd sit with my editor, Sonia Polanski, and we'd play them, and they were important that I would try to make the scene play to the music. Very often you go in and you have an idea for a song and you play it against the scene and it doesn't work. So you find another song that does. Wooly Bully is the opening song. We played Wooly Bully for the kids. And I said to Rosanna and her two friends in the scene, when the music turns off, start into your lines. You can be talking before, like you're just walking down the thing, but the minute the music turns off, start into your lines. And all you kids who are talking with each other, just lip sync, don't make any noise from now on. But what it got is a bunch of teenage kids coming out of their classrooms bopping to Wooly Bully. So it was a nice experience, which I rarely had later, of knowing I could get the songs and being able to sometimes play them for the actors, sometimes while they were walking around. And so they're kind of in rhythm or certainly in mood with the song. Robert Downey, when he saw the movie, because a couple of his good scenes got cut, he was calling the movie Maybe It's You. So he was really funny. There was a scene where he was dancing with Jill, and he's like her nightmare nerdy Jewish boy date. There was a scene there was a party in a basement that was like a Leslie Gore, "It's My Party and I'll Cry If I Want to" scene, and they were eating pizza. Amy was in the movie. There's a scene where she's a guidance counselor or something like that. Griffin had a little scene, I forget what it was, and they both got cut. I might have been in it somewhere. I might have cut myself out of it. When I saw the movie, when we edited it, good scene, I don't think we need it, and I think the journey for the audience is going to be better if it's a little shorter, and there's I don't need, what you often discover is, especially when your actors really nail their characters, I don't need this scene to explain this about the character, and there goes a 3-minute scene, or I think we get it. I think the audience will get what's going on here and the dynamic of what's going on here, sociologically and, just kind of personally with the characters without this scene, which was really helpful for people reading, including the actors reading it, understand it, and maybe even the people who financed it, And then what you realize is almost never do they remember a scene. So if you cut something and it was their favorite scene, they probably don't remember by now because they've got dozens of movies, in production, about to be in production, thinking about production. She'd mostly been an assistant, and she'd worked, as an assistant for some interesting directors and with some good editors. And I just kind of liked her vibe. And so what was fun is I was always in the editing room pretty much. I was usually... I might be working on montages while she was doing straight scenes, and then we might change, So a lot of what I did was work with, and I've worked with John Tintori on 8 Men Out this way, kind of the way that you work with an actor, which is, okay, here's what I want. So I would talk about takes where I thought let's try to use this for this line and this for the rest of the scene and emphasize this. And then you see what they come out with, and that's like take number 1 with an actor. And then you say, okay, this moment here isn't working yet. Try, see what you can do with that one. Look at the other takes or whatever. I don't think we need to cut back so many times. And can we make it faster? Or we can slow it down, and then you see their next take. So you're still directing, but you're directing an editor, not an actor. What I try to tell my actors is, look, it's, we're working on this, let it all hang out. I'm not going to put anything embarrassing in there. We did good stuff here, but it's going to be better when it's edited. It's not going to be worse when it's edited. So if you feel like we never got a great take, we did 3 takes with coverage. I have so much ammunition here. I can make this thing a half minute quicker. I can make it 3 minutes quicker. I can stretch it out. I can make moments that you guys never made between you. We're moving on. They saw the first cut. And I think really what happened is, as I said, they read the script a long, long time ago and they saw the movie. Porky's had come out. Fast Times at Ridgemont High had come out, and they just wanted something more like that, a much more broad, audience-pleasing, mainstream movie. And that's what they thought they could make out of Baby It's You. They got very nervous during the college part. It wasn't a nostalgic teen movie anymore. And so we started fighting over the cut. And I said, look, it's your movie, you paid for it. I'm just not going to put my name on it if it's not a movie I think is good, and where you're going, I don't think is good, and so they did a couple more test screenings, which did about the same. They stewed for a while and they said, okay, do it your way. And I think that was some of why they didn't really kill themselves in the distribution of it. Yeah, it got pretty good reviews, but I don't read reviews. So I heard they were pretty good. We had this interesting phenomenon when we started doing test screenings and press screenings and stuff like that. We would show the movie and the lights would come and people would leave and they'd be talking about the movie. And there was almost always one woman of a certain age weeping because this was her story. It's like, oh yeah, well, sorry. Sorry it didn't work out. Occasionally it's somebody's favorite movie. Very often a woman who was that age then, and had, a kind of character arc like the characters in the movie. I think it was Leo Burmester was in a couple of my movies saying, I got to tell you this, I couldn't sleep one night and, I turned the TV on and there was this high school movie and I hate high school movies, but I got sucked into it and I watched the rest of it and then I looked up what it was and it was Baby It's You. I'm always happy when it gets seen, is you make movies to get seen and they're just things until somebody's watching them and interacting with it, and then they're kind of alive. And so, it doesn't matter where it is, whether it's at a film festival or, on a cable show late at night. For me, it's just great in any form that people see it.